Hello again. In this lesson, we'll discuss why it is not the same to teach learners of different ages. Children, teenagers, and adults learn in different ways, and therefore we need to use different kinds of strategies. So let's begin by explaining why age is so important in language teaching. Number one, because one of the critical variables in language acquisition is obviously age. Secondly, it is important for us, the teachers, to adapt our strategies and our teaching methodologies according to the learner's cognitive, emotional, and physical development. And last but not least, the teaching approaches that we're going to use will vary according to the learner's ages. Another obvious question is whether or not younger learners learn better, faster, and more effectively than older learners. In this regard, it is important to mention that age, of course, has a really powerful impact on the development skills. So we have, for example, Lionel Messi. He started playing soccer between 4 and 5 years old, and Michael Phelps started swimming at 7 years old. Usain Bolt started running, in school when he was 12, and Simone Biles started gymnastics at 6 years old. Some other examples: LeBron James, Serena Williams, Michael Jackson, Ed Sheeran, all of whom started doing the things that they did so well at a really young age. Now, talking about language learning specifically, there are some theories. For example, we know that first language acquisition occurs naturally, spontaneously, and relatively easily in the first 3 years of life. We also know that, native speakers of a language who acquire the languages at a very young age, develop full functional competence regardless of any other kinds of factors. And there is even a theory in particular, the critical period hypothesis, that suggests that after 3 years of age, it may be harder to learn new languages. However, it is important to mention that, research has also shown that older students often are better than younger learners, especially in school-based language learning, and that even if it's not a general case, adult learners can and they develop native-like proficiency. So this means that there are some other factors like agency, exposure, and cognitive development that can help adult learners to achieve high levels of proficiency despite their age. So, what makes language learners different depending on their age? Well, there are two sets of factors. First of all, cognitive development, and secondly, affective factors. So, children, teenagers, and adults are going to be different in terms of their attention span, for example, and the differences in concrete versus abstract thinking. If we give some examples of affective factors, we can mention, for example, inhibition, which is a very important factor, especially in adolescence, and other factors like motivation, the kinds of motivation that learners have, and that will have an impact on their ultimate level of success. Now we will look at some specific differences in the way young learners, teenage learners, and adult learners learn. So, first of all, let's begin with young learners. It is obvious that these kind of learners are going to benefit mostly from implicit learning. That means no grammar explanation, just direct language, because they learn better by imitation, memorization, and repetition. That, of course, children require engaging and sensory rich activities that keep them focused, right? And it is obvious that they get distracted if your materials lack visual or emotional appeal. So everything has to be focused on keeping their attention. And finally, the motivation from children is mostly external, prizes like a little star on their foreheads or maybe a fun game. They are not goal oriented, they focus on the here and the now. Now, concerning teenagers, they are different because now at this age they are capable of using explicit learning strategies, right? So there could be more, little grammar explanations, for example, if that's your thing. Learning is still mandatory for them. They don't choose to learn English, so the motivation is kind of tricky. You need to find, what makes them tick and use this to your advantage. Teenagers are sensitive to identity and social issues, so it is important that teachers build trust in a very careful way. And last but not least, because of their affective states, they prefer respectful, firm, but interesting teachers that offer a clear structure in their lessons. Finally, if we talk about adults, we can say obviously that they are highly motivated and usually they learn because they want to learn. At this level of cognitive development, they can use all kinds of conscious learning strategies in a very effective way. And obviously, they appreciate grammar explanations, vocabulary list, and they like to have practical applications for the things that they learn. And finally, adult learners can be more demanding because obviously they know more, they have expectations, so they want professionalism and relevance in the lessons. Now, based on these characteristics, we can use different kinds of strategies. So for teaching young learners, we're going to use lots of pictures, stories, games, chants, and in general, language play. We're going to try to have a different kind of activities. We're going to be changing all the time, and we're going to focus on movement and fun. We can also use attractive visuals, storytelling, so that we can keep their attention and engagement in the content of the class, right? And finally, we're going to avoid abstract explanations, so no grammar, please. And we're going to go for a meaningful language exposure. Some strategies that we can use with teenagers. Well, first of all, we're going to use themes or topics that match their interest. Everything has to be focused on their center of interest. Music, pop culture, their opinions, their lives, right? We also have to use a good number of PBIS strategies. That means positive behavioral interventions and supports. Some things like using group work is going to support the risk-taking and self-expression. And we're going to try to include also critical thinking and real-world issues. Teenagers like to express their points of view, and we need to use this to our advantage. Now finally, when we teach adults, it is important to avoid too much abstract grammar explanations. We can give them grammar because they need it. They need to understand things, but we have to reduce that to a minimum, obviously. Right? We have to show them respect. Remember that they are adults, they don't speak English, but they have lots of knowledge of the world. We also have to let them make choices whenever this is possible, obviously, so that they can feel that they have control of their own learning. And something very important is to allow them to share their stories and address their interests, especially when it comes to vocational and avocational interests. So just to conclude, here's a summary of the main takeaways for teaching young learners, teenagers, and adult learners. First of all, children thrive on implicit learning and play. Fun, fun, fun. In the case of teenagers, they need structure, they need order, they need relevance, and of course sensitivity, because they are building their identity and they have a very fragile ego. And finally, adult learners value explicit explanations, efficiency, they want to see results, and they want to see real world application to the things that you're teaching them. As you can see, it is very important to consider our learners' age when we teach them English, because they are going to be affected by a certain number of affective factors, and they're going to have a different level of cognitive development. and this is important for us to adapt our teaching to their particular needs and interests. Thanks a lot for your attention, and see you next time.